Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Behave. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and to all members of the Assembly, an honor to introduce some guests here that have joined us in the Legislature today. Mr. Speaker, seated in your gallery are the President of Child Find Saskatchewan, Phyllis Halat, Executive Director of EGADS, Don Meikle, and two inspirational youth mentors at EGADS, Diane Nagy-Chief and LaShonda Cardinal. They are joining us here today during Missing Children's Month in Saskatchewan. Child Find Saskatchewan, along with the network of volunteers across our province, works hard to highlight issues relating to missing children. They promote a message of a missing child is everyone's responsibility and that all children have the right to be safe. I would like to thank Ms. Halat and the many individuals involved with Child Find Saskatchewan for making a difference in the lives of Saskatchewan's children and their families. Mr. Speaker, EGADS in Saskatoon works hard to provide programs and services to children, youth, and their families to improve their quality of life. Their Operation Runaway program focuses on building strong relationships and using positive supports to encourage change in behavior, an effort to reduce the number of runaways in Saskatoon. Don Meikle is a trusted leader within their programs. Among the youth he interacts with and throughout the community in Saskatoon. I appreciate all the time and effort he has put into EGADS over the years, and I'm glad to call him a personal friend. Diana and LaShonda began their journey with EGADS as clients. They have since started a youth committee to help service providers better understand why youth go missing and what they need to be successful. Recently, Diana began working at the University of Saskatchewan Computer Science Department to develop an app for runaways and their caregivers. This app will assist both parties in creating common ground to ensure safe return home. I want to thank Diane and LaShonda for their incredible work that they're doing as leaders and mentors to other youth in Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in welcoming Phyllis, Don, Diana, and LaShonda to their Legislative Assembly. Here, here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert, Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the opposition, I also would like to welcome the individuals from Child Find and EGADS to the Assembly. It's Missing Children's Month, and we know with the green ribbons that's a way for us to recognize how important it is to be mindful that we still have children in our province that are missing and how these families are impacted. And the work that Child Find does to provide support for those families is crucial and time sensitive. And it's incredibly valuable support that you provide to the families, and we really appreciate everything that you do. The individuals at EGADS, I had an opportunity to tour some of the services there, and I was very amazed of what you provide for services in Saskatoon. It's very valuable, and I know that a lot of the youth that utilize services there feel comfortable with receiving services. The adult leaders there are very knowledgeable and helpful with helping them become our future leaders in our city, and we really appreciate it. And with the young mentors, I really appreciate to see you getting right involved in your community and being advocates for youth within your community, and I could see that you're going to be future leaders as well, and I look forward to seeing you in future roles as well. So thank you for coming here and representing the province, and we really appreciate all the work. So on behalf of the official opposition, we welcome you to your Legislative Assembly. While I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I also would like to introduce a couple more guests that are in your gallery. It's my daughter Melissa and her son Riker, my grandson. And I'm so happy to have them here today. I'm very proud of both of them. My daughter, Melissa, she is in university, becoming a social worker. She's at the First Nations University, and she works at Ranch Arrow as a youth worker. And so she provides a lot of leadership also to youth in our community, and she's also an incredible mom to Riker, and so I'm very proud of her. Riker is a big fan of Spider-Man and Power Rangers, and he also loves to watch Scooby-Doo and Paw Patrol. But he really likes to have a lot of fun going to Raider games with Grandma and Grandpa and his dad, and he loves to cheer on our Raiders. But he knows Regina for the Riders because he comes to Rider games with Papa and Grandma. And even this morning he woke up and said, "Are we going to a football game?" So, so he loves coming to Regina, and he's been really excited to come and see Grandma at her magical workplace, so I'm so happy to have him here. He's also a role model for my other two younger grandsons, and he loves to play with Sawyer and Levi. So I want to welcome both Melissa and Riker to their Legislative Assembly, and I ask all members to welcome them as well. So.
Recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I request leave for a couple of introductions.
Minister's requested leave for extended introductions. Leave granted. Recognize the Minister.
Thank you for that, Mr. Speaker. To you and all the members this afternoon, I'd like to introduce some volunteers, supporters, and a participant with Kid Sports Saskatchewan. I know we're all familiar with that excellent charity designed to assist children and families facing financial barriers to participate in community sports programs. In the house today is Scarlett Starr, a Kids Sport participant from Albert Community School here in Regina. Kids Sport has supported Scarlett in numerous activities including soccer, gymnastics, and hockey. Scarlett says she likes playing sport because it's fun. She gets to meet new friends and learn new things. Also joining us today is Jerry Shoemaker, Chair of Kids Sport Saskatchewan. He's served as a volunteer on the committee since 2014 and was a former board member of SaSport. Dorothy Josephson is the past president of SaSport and past chair of Kids Sport, and has spent much of her life in Saskatchewan advocating for equal opportunities in sport. We also have Craig Reynolds, is the president and CEO of the Rough Riders, and we note that the Rough Riders have been a partner of Kids Sport for over 20 years. I understand Naaman Roosevelt is currently the Kids Sport ambassador. We appreciate their involvement again for many decades. I also note, see Kevin Gilroy up there, the CEO of SaSport. So I ask all members to recognize this group and to thank everyone involved in the Kids Sport program, all the volunteers, and it's a great program to reduce barriers to participation in sport, culture, and recreation activities here in our province. And if I could, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to continue with the sports theme and highlight maybe some current Kids Sport participants who may be involved in future summer games. And we're highlighting today the organizers of the 2019 Western Canada Summer Games and some Saskatchewan athletes who will be competing this summer, taking place, of course, in Swift Current from August 9th to 18th. This marks the 5th time our province has hosted these great games. Over 1,700 athletes, parasport, Special Olympians, coaches, managers will be traveling to Swift in southwest Saskatchewan from Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Manitoba, and Alberta in 16 different summer sports. So today, Mr. Speaker, marks the 100 days out marker for the games. A couple of the athletes here this afternoon are a couple of divers, Kelsey Claremont and Paige McKenzie. They both go to Martin Collegiate here in Regina. And representing where Western Canada Summer Games athletes can aspire to, Mr. Speaker, is Taryn Suddy. Taryn competed in the 2011 Western Canada Games and became a champion for shot put and hammer. And silver in the discus, had a great career to compete internationally at the 2011 University Games, Pan Am Games in 2015, the Olympic Games in 2016, and the Commonwealth Games in 2018. And there's also some organizers and volunteers from the Games joining us here today, including Denise Barbier, who's the Games manager, who has over 20 years of experience with multi-sport games. And also volunteer co-chairs Mark Benish and Melissa Shaw. Mark's day job is superintendent for the Chinook School Division. He's been a multi-sport coach for over 30 years and experience competing both as a player and a coach. And Melissa is the aquatic superintendent for the City of Swift Current. Sheena Gatsky is also in attendance as the Director of Volunteer Program and Volunteer Recruitment. Sheena has a long history of volunteerism and philanthropy throughout her life. Also joining us today, finally, is His Worship Mayor Dennis Perot and wife Leah. Thanks for being here. I'm sure they're, along with many people in Southwest Saskatchewan, very excited to showcase the great city of Swift Current, and I ask all members to welcome these folks and all these volunteers and all the work that's gone in so far to host the Western Canada Summer Games, and we wish them all the best, all the success for all the athletes and the volunteers in the cities, for that city in the fall, and wish them all the best.
You're here.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to join in with the Minister and welcome all these guests to their legislature. It's quite a list of people who make things happen for our young people in Saskatchewan. Kids Sport folks, I just want to thank you, and we want to thank you for the leadership you show in our communities. I know this program has been going on for decades, and it's a wonderful thing that we make sure that we get rid of the barriers for kids so they can participate in sports, so that things like the Western Canadian Games can happen. So thank you very much. And all of you, there's quite a list of dignitaries. I see Craig Reynolds from the Riders and various folks. Thank you so much on behalf of the opposition. And the Summer Games, I can speak from as a parent, and also that the athletes look so sharp in your outfits. I think we have 2 or 3 suits at home from Western Canadian Games, and I was just leaning over to my colleague and wondering, where are you going to have rowing in Swift Current? That's what my daughter did, but I'm sure you've got a great venue. But thank you all, for the Mayor of Swift Current, the co-chairs, everyone right down to the athletes. A very, very important thing. Not only does it build excellence in sports, but community spirit and healthy living. So thank you for this leadership. And also, I just want to give a shout out to Don Michael. I've known him. People say I've been around a long time, but Don's been around longer. And so that means decades, Don. Thank you so much for your work and the leadership of the mentors there. Glad to see you back here at your legislature. Thank you all, and have a good summer and doing all the work you do. Thank you.
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. It's with pleasure I introduce a couple new to Yorkton in your gallery up in the upper right-hand side. Corey Karlick from Yorkton This Week and Emily Fulford from GX94 News in Yorkton. I've gotten to know them very well over the last little while. Very interested in politics, invited them down to witness proceedings, and they'll be introduced in the House today, Mr. Speaker. So I ask all members to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you and all members of the Legislative Assembly, I'd like to welcome, seated in the West Gallery, 49 History 10 students from the Melville Comprehensive. They're accompanied by their principal, Brandon Needham, and history teacher, Andy Rondo. I'd also like to take the opportunity to congratulate the Melville students for medaling very well at the Skills Canada SAS competition recently in Regina, where they won medals in photography, outdoor power and rec, video production, construction, welding, and a gold medal in cabinet making. I would like all members to welcome the Melville Comp students and their teachers to their Legislative Assembly.
Presenting petitions, recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens, businesses, and communities from all across Saskatchewan as it relates to the Sask Party government's imposition of the PST onto construction labor, Mr. Speaker. Quite simply, this is the epitome of a job-killing tax. Mr. Speaker, what we saw was a government that saw a slowing economy and that sadly hit the brakes, Mr. Speaker. And the results speak for themselves. Since the imposition of this PST, we see permits down all across Saskatchewan. We see projects that are important being shelved, and we see thousands of Saskatchewan tradespeople that have lost their jobs, Mr. Speaker. The result of that for many of those tradespeople is that they've been forced to leave the province in pursuit of employment, Mr. Speaker, and that's a loss for all of us. And the prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions today are signed by concerned citizens of Regina, Yorkton, and Pine House.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to present a petition calling for a public inquiry and forensic audit into the Regina bypass land scandal. And the people who have signed this petition wish to bring to our attention the following. Land developers purchased 640 acres of land along Tower Road and had the Regina bypass moved to accommodate their developments. Thousands of people were impacted directly, lost their land, their homes, their businesses, their access, their life's work, their health, their history, and their future. Land developers were paid up to 80 times more for their land than long-term land, home, and business owners. And the cost of the Regina bypass exploded from $400 million to now over $2 billion. I'll read the prayer, Mr. Speaker. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call for a judicial public inquiry and forensic audit into the entire Regina bypass land scandal. And Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing the petition today are from Regina, Regina Beach, and Marquess, Saskatchewan. I so submit.
Hear, hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside Saskatchewan, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. You know, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But you know, Mr. Speaker, that over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, simply, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. And we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer now. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to overhaul Saskatchewan campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition today come from the communities of Kenora and Ryan, Saskatchewan. I do so present.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud today to provide petitions calling for the restoration of public intermunicipal transportation for persons with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, the individuals who have signed these petitions want to draw your attention to the following points: that the cruel and heartless Sask Party budget of 2017 cut public intermunicipal transportation services for persons with disabilities, including all people with various abilities. This decision has left persons with disabilities stranded and isolated in both urban and rural communities. That since cutting transportation services for persons with disabilities, the Sask Party has failed to replace this service in any meaningful way. That the Sask Party failed to perform an audit of their decision and do not fully understand the economic and social cost of cutting STC. And by cutting STC, the Sask Party is failing to honour their commitment to make Saskatchewan the best place in Canada for persons with disabilities. That the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code states access to equal, dignified transportation is essential to the achievement of equality for persons with disabilities, and that persons with disabilities have a human right to adequate, dignified public transportation services on an equal basis. The Code guarantees that right to equal treatment with respect to services without discrimination based on disability. Mr. Speaker, I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan immediately restore public intermunicipal transportation services for persons with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue for people across this whole province, and these petitions have been signed from individuals in many of the municipalities across our province, but I'll only read a few of these towns and cities: Regina, Odessa, Indian Head, Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, and Biggar. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, today is the 115th International Workers' Day, also known as May Day, one of the most important days on the calendar for workers of the world. In 1886, thousands of workers from all over North America rallied together to support workers that had been killed while striking for an 8-hour working day. Since 1904, workers have marked May 1st as a time to remember those that died for the gains that have been made to advance workers' rights and to improve workplace safety. While members opposite may be correct in noting that Judean shepherds didn't have an 8-hour workday or benefits, Mr. Speaker, the fact that many workers have them now is thanks in large part to those that gathered in Haymarket Square over 100 years ago. May Day is about the promotion and protection of rights on an international scale, and the fight is far from over. Saskatchewan should be setting the bar for workplace safety. Instead, we see workplace injuries and fatalities on the rise. We should be paying a living wage, Mr. Speaker. Instead, many workers are faced with the impossible decision to pay for food or for rent, and across the world, workers are still being denied their basic labor rights. Mr. Speaker, there's no one in this House that has not benefited from that which was fought for in Haymarket Square. I would ask all members to join with me in recognizing May Day. I'm honored to stand in solidarity with workers throughout the world and calling for fair and safe working conditions for everyone. Happy May Day, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to advise all members that May has been proclaimed as Missing Children's Month in Saskatchewan. This month is an important opportunity to raise awareness of missing children and their families. This year, I'm pleased to recognize the important work that EGADS has been doing in Saskatoon through their Operation Runaway program. The development of a risk assessment tool used by EGADS has resulted in 276 fewer reports of missing youth between September 2018 and March of 2019. In March of 2019, our government announced $125,000 for EGADS to continue Operation Runaway and build on the successes they've had giving Saskatoon youth a voice to help reduce or eliminate the amount of times they run away. Mr. Speaker, in conjunction with Missing Children's Month, Child Find Saskatchewan is also running its 28th annual Green Ribbon Hope campaign. The Green Ribbon is a symbol of hope that missing children will return home safely. Mr. Speaker, we appreciate the role that Child Find Saskatchewan plays in assisting law enforcement agencies and other partners to locate missing children and educate children and adults about being safe. I'm proud to stand with EGADS and Child Find Saskatchewan in their efforts to reduce the number of children who go missing in our province. A missing child is everyone's responsibility. Thank you.
And as a member for Cumberland.
Cravings Late Night Food and Air Range has switched to mostly paper takeout containers and utensils. Jamie and Charmaine Charles own and operate Cravings Late Night Food in northern Saskatchewan.
Good burger.
Jamie Charles said he's seen garbage from his restaurant around the community and was worried about the impact it had on the environment. We know that plastic straws and foam containers can take decades to decompose, and it is best not to use them in the first place. Cravings decided to ban both materials from their restaurant, which serves some of the most delicious food in the community. The other advantage is food quality stays fresher than in foam containers. The new utensils are made from a cornstarch base and are biodegradable. This change is great for the community, and I see it having a positive effect on the environment in our beautiful north. I want to congratulate Jamie and Charmaine Charles for running a great business and for thinking about the future generations and the environment at the same time. I want to thank them, Mr. Speaker, for their great work they do in our community.
You're here.
As a member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, Pitch at Palace Canada 1.0 headed west to the prairies, holding their Prairie Entrepreneurs Pitch event right here in Regina at Government House. The Right Honourable David Johnston, 28th Governor General of Canada, joined the day to hear the exciting pitches himself. Entrepreneurs of 15 companies from the region spent the morning in workshops with mentors and interacting amongst others. In the afternoon, the entrepreneurs took the stage to deliver rapid 3-minute business pitches reflecting a wide variety of sectors. Congratulations to the 4 finalists who will advance to the Pitch at Palace 1.0 boot camp and final in Toronto at the end of May. The finalists are Krugo, an app that simplifies group travel, allowing friends to plan and join trip itineraries, buy tickets, and discover events. Aura, a safety panic alarm button to help keep seniors and employees safe. Lumeka Health, a virtual clinic that fits in your pocket, allows you to speak to licensed doctors and nurses by web, phone, or mobile apps. And Precision AI, it provides agriculture artificial intelligence for autonomous farming. On behalf of all members, Mr. Speaker, we would like to say congratulations to the finalists, and we wish you luck in the finals in Toronto. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Swift Current.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd first like to begin by acknowledging the pins that we are all wearing today. These pins represent the 2019 Western Canada Summer Games. 100 days from today, Swift Current and Southwest Saskatchewan will play host to these games from August 9th to the 18th. This is exciting for the city of Swift Current, all of Southwest Saskatchewan, and our entire province. This event will provide many benefits to athletes across Western Canada, the territories, and to the community of Swift Current and the surrounding area. Our government is proud to provide $1.5 million for administration and program delivery to support the Western Canada Summer Games. As the opening ceremonies draw closer on August 9th, we are reminded how important the volunteers are to making the Games a success. I would like to thank the volunteers who have already signed up and to remind folks that more volunteers are needed. In fact, we'll need about 2,000 volunteers to help make the Games a success. And we're also looking for additional corporate sponsorship as well. To get in the game through volunteerism or other forms, I'd encourage anyone interested to visit the Western Canada Summer Games website. You can also reach them on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Also, online ticket sales are open today, so I'd encourage everyone to get your tickets early for the Games. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask all members to join me in thanking all those involved in the 2019 Western Canada Summer Games and wish them a successful 2 weeks in beautiful Southwest Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Here. And as a member for Indian Head Milestone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to recognize National Doctors' Day, May 1st. Mr. Speaker, we all know that physicians play a vital role in Saskatchewan's communities. That is why our government has maintained a steadfast commitment to physician recruitment and retention in our province. Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to make tremendous progress. It's amazing, Mr. Speaker, where we've come from the previous government. The number of licensed physicians in Saskatchewan has steadily increased to almost 2,700. Wow. We now have over 920 more general practitioners and specialists that we have recruited since 2007. Mr. Speaker, this is an overall increase of 53% over the past decade. We have 44% more general practitioners, 64% more specialists, and 34% more psychiatrists, and nearly double the number of pediatricians. Mr. Speaker, we've increased the number of medical undergrad seats from 60 to 100, doubled the number of medical residency positions to 120, and established more family medicine residency training sites across the province. We have recruited more than 200 internationally trained physicians to our province, Mr. Speaker, many of which who are working in rural Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest in recruitment and retention initiatives and work with SaskDocs and the health sector partners to recruit physicians where they are needed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Great job. Recognize the member for Martensville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start with a heads up to the NDP leader. People record what he says. Yesterday, once again confronted with his support of Trudeau's carbon tax, he said, and I quote, "The member would like to invent quotes that do not belong to me," end quote. Well, here are the facts about the NDP leader's position in his own words. From CKOM, quote, "There is a model that works. There is an argument to be made for putting a price on carbon," end quote. From the Leader Post, quote, "I think carbon pricing is a model that works," end quote. From the Chief, quote, he says that carbon pricing has been shown to be a decent economic and environmental policy, end quote. From the CBC, quote, "Putting a price on carbon is really just a practical way of decreasing emissions," end quote. From the CBC, quote, "Miley has said he supports the federal government's plan to put a price on carbon," end quote. From the CBC, quote, "We applaud the federal government's recent announcement on a minimum price on carbon," end quote. From the CBC, quote, "He supports the federal government's plan to put a price on carbon," end quote. And Mr. Speaker, from his very own leadership platform, quote, "We can and should support a national approach to carbon pricing," end quote. Mr. Speaker, these are not invented quotes. They are the Leader of the Opposition's own words. So while he stands with Trudeau on the carbon tax, we will stand against those things and stand with the people of this province, Mr. Speaker.
Period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been hearing a lot of noise recently from the Premier about equalization. My question is the Premier at all serious about getting a better deal for Saskatchewan?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that the government of this province is serious enough to put a proposal on the floor, Mr. Speaker, to put a proposal to Canadians, our 50-50 equalization formula, Mr. Speaker, that we had put out a number of months ago. Mr. Speaker, we most certainly are serious about having the conversation around how we share our wealth from this great province with the rest of Canadians in light.
Member for Athabasca, please come to order. Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in light of this nation having the conversation around how do we actually generate our wealth in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and how we generate our wealth is by having a competitive tax and regulatory regime here in the province where we can compete with our competitors around the world, the ability to get those products to market, whether it be over the rails or through a pipeline, Mr. Speaker, and ultimately to ensure that we have our trade relationships with our trading partners all around the world. That's how we create our wealth with our sustainable natural resource industries in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and if we're going to continue to do that and share that wealth with the rest of Canada, Mr. Speaker, we need to be able to actually get those products to market, Mr. Speaker. If we are not, then we have to have a serious conversation about the equalization formula in this province.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Premier is serious about getting a change to the equalization program and the equalization formula in Canada, does he believe that his predecessor, Mr. Wall, made a mistake by leaving that alone 10 years ago?
Recognize the Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the decisions of this government around equalization, Mr. Speaker, we have had the conversation with previous federal governments and we continue to have that conversation with the current federal government, Mr. Speaker. But at the end of the day, what we are talking about is how do we, as a prosperous province of Saskatchewan, a have province, if you will, over the course of the last decade, Mr. Speaker. How are we able to continue to create and generate that wealth in Saskatchewan so that we have the opportunity to share it with the rest of the nation, Mr. Speaker? Right now, we're having a very challenging conversation around how do we get our sustainable energy products in Western Canada to market, Mr. Speaker. We're having that conversation actually with an NDP government from British Columbia that doesn't want to see that happen, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in this province, we have agriculture, we have the energy industry, we have a sustainable manufacturing industry, Mr. Speaker, and a great mining powerhouse of an industry here in Saskatchewan that creates wealth for not only the people in this province, but we share it with the rest of the nation, Mr. Speaker. And if we're not allowed to continue to do that, we need to have a conversation around the equalization formula in this nation.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An estimated $800 million a year could have been coming to Saskatchewan if we'd had a change in formula a decade ago. But the Sask Party, having once promised to pursue a different route, having once promised to correct that formula by taking it to court, backed away. And they did so when the position of who was in government in Ottawa changed. So my question is, what will this Premier do? Will his position change the way his predecessor did if there's a change in who's in leadership in Ottawa?
Recognize the Premier.
It sounds like we want to make a wager on the federal election on the floor of the legislature here, Mr. Speaker. You know, we'll leave the federal election to be determined by each and every Canadian in the nation that's going to have the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to vote for a party of their choice, Mr. Speaker. I would say, quite frankly, that what I see shaping up in this province is you're going to see people line up behind a party that is going to support those very industries that I talked about, Mr. Speaker. You're not going to see people of this province line up behind a party that, quite frankly, supports a carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, behind a party that does not support pipelines, Mr. Speaker. And maybe if the leader of the opposition in this province wants to actually do some serious advocacy on behalf of the hardworking people of Saskatchewan, he could talk to his federal counterpart, the federal leader of the opposition, on where he is when it comes to a carbon tax, where he is when it comes to pipelines, getting the Trans Mountain pipeline or the Energy East pipeline in place, Mr. Speaker. Maybe he could do some advocacy within his own party so that we can actually get to a place where we can continue to create wealth in this province for all of the people that live here and the rest of the nation included.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the question remains, the Premier seems to be frustrated by the equalization formula. He's made lots of noise about it on social media, but we haven't seen any movement towards something that could actually make a difference, that could make a change. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Premier is this. Once again, does the Premier think that his predecessor made a mistake, that the member for Meadow Lake made a mistake, that Andrew Scheer and Stephen Harper made a mistake when they backed away from their previous promise to change the formula? Or does he think that the formula is just fine?
Recognize the Premier.
Speaker, the Minister of Finance just handed me letter after letter after letter after letter of correspondence that we have with the federal government with respect to equalization, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the formula that we had put forward, Mr. Speaker. We were the only province, to my knowledge, that has actually put forward a real proposal with respect to what equalization should look like into the future. Mr. Speaker, I guess I would ask this. In fairness, I would ask this. Will the Leader of the Opposition advocate with his federal leader on behalf of Saskatchewan residents for our natural resource industries here in the province? Will he advocate for pipelines? Mr. Speaker, with the leader of the federal NDP party, will he advocate against a carbon tax on the industries that is harmful to the industries in this province, Mr. Speaker, supported by this member, supported by the federal leader, but will he advocate with his federal leader, Mr. Speaker, with respect to those policies? Will he advocate with his federal leader in support of the 50-50 equalization formula here in the province?
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fact of the matter is that a formula has been put forward by New Democrats and agreed to by Sask Party members, a formula to remove non-renewable resources from the equalization formula. It's a practical way of recognizing the realities of our economy, and we could pursue that through a court case. My question is, now this Premier's government walked away from that court case after having promised to pursue it. My question is now, we still have that in front of us. Why doesn't this Premier decide today? Take that court case forward, then it doesn't matter who's elected come this fall. We know that we're continuing to work for the best interests of Saskatchewan and for a fair formula for our natural resources.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it matters who's elected as a federal leader this fall. Trust me, it matters, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is as I said, Mr. Speaker, in light of us being restricted with our ability to build pipelines, to continue to create wealth in this province, Mr. Speaker, that is the key to us continuing to grow our communities, grow our opportunities, and really grow our wealth and careers in towns and villages and cities and rural municipalities right across this province, Mr. Speaker. In order to do that, In order to do that, to even have the conversation about sharing our wealth through equalization with the rest of Canadians, we need pipelines and we need that infrastructure in place, Mr. Speaker. So my question is this. Will the leader of the Saskatchewan NDP, although he accepted a donation from the BC NDP, Mr. Speaker, will he advocate with the BC NDP to allow the Trans Mountain Pipeline to actually be constructed on behalf of Saskatchewan residents so that we can contribute to the rest of our nation? Mr. Speaker, that's the question I have.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're very clear that we want to see Saskatchewan products get to market. We want to grow our economy, but we also want to make sure that we're keeping a fair share of that growth right here in the province. And the party opposite walked away.
Minister of Energy, please come to order. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
The government across the way walked away from an opportunity to do so, backed away from a promise, and left us hundreds of millions of dollars short. Mr. Speaker, dollars that could have been invested in things like the mental health of children, things like education. Yesterday, the Children's Advocate called it shameful. Shameful that we're not doing enough for kids in mental health crises and that we can and should be preventing suicides among our young people. And the numbers tell the same shameful story. Today, as of March in Saskatoon, there's still more than 300 kids with significant mental health needs waiting just to get an appointment. Mr. Speaker, across the province, there are over 700. When will the Premier recognize the crisis in mental health care in Saskatchewan is real? When will he make sure that Saskatchewan kids have the care that they deserve?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, this government takes mental health of our citizens, specifically our youth, very seriously, Mr. Speaker, and including those in northern communities. That's why if you look at our budgets year over year, Mr. Speaker, they've continually increased, a large majority of that going to mental health supports and mental health and addiction supports. If we look at our budgets over the last 10 years, they've increased by 55 to 60% health-wide. If you look at the northern regions, Mr. Speaker, the previous northern regions, that average is more like 70-75%. When we look at the investments that have happened over the last number of years, specifically in this last budget, up to almost 7% of our health budget. But, Mr. Speaker, $30 million increase this year, targeted specifically at a lot of those issues that we've been hearing about over the last couple of years, and specifically to some of these situations that we're seeing. We heard earlier the member for Indian Head Milestone talking about the increase in physicians, some of them specialists, Mr. Speaker. Those numbers are increasing steadily, including psychiatric supports, including outside of those other disciplines, mental health workers. Mr. Speaker, will continue to invest in our people and our youth.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister can describe the efforts made, but the results speak for themselves. They're not getting the job done. Not getting the job done for kids across the province, kids who are struggling today with anxiety, with depression, kids who are taking their own lives, Mr. Speaker. This is very serious. We've got 300 kids with significant mental health needs in Saskatoon waiting for mental health supports. That shouldn't be considered acceptable to any of us. And kids are still waiting more than a year to get an appointment with a child psychiatrist. Well, kids are ready for help. They need that help right that moment. They need it right away. If not, they're at danger of seeing their condition worsen, resulting in worse outcomes and worse costs for the system. We need to be investing in kids' mental health and their access to care now, Mr. Speaker. What's the plan for this government to get rid of those waiting lists in mental health and get us enough child psychiatrists so that kids aren't waiting a year before they get the help they need?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The wait times in Saskatoon for children to see a psychiatrist is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. We've taken action there. Officials have changed the way children are triaged, Mr. Speaker. They've made some other changes that have helped lower the wait times, but they're still unacceptably long, Mr. Speaker. Part of the answer, of course, is recruitment. I'm told by officials that we're online to have 2 more physicians starting, Mr. Speaker, this summer, I believe. Mr. Speaker, recruitment's part of the issue, triage, as I said. It's important to note that child psychiatrists in the province, there's 3 locations that they're at, Prince Albert, Saskatoon, and Regina. Saskatoon is an anomaly. Regina wait times are much shorter. Prince Albert, they are as well, Mr. Speaker. We recognize the seriousness of the situation in Saskatoon, and we're taking action to rectify it.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Just days ago, the Children's Advocate called the wait times for mental health services for children and youth shameful. Sitting on a wait list for mental health care can be incredibly difficult for those kids in need, and thanks to the good work of our community-based organizations in the province, there's often a place for them to turn. These organizations save lives. But this government has flatlined health CBO funding for years, and these organizations are buckling under the pressure of increased demand, utility rate hikes, and the impacts of the PST. Does the minister really think 3% over 5 years is sustainable? And at a time when we should be doing more about mental health, is it acceptable that these organizations are at risk of providing less support to those in need?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, this government recognizes the good work that CBOs do right across the spectrum in providing services to the good people of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I have the news release from the budget on mental health and addictions, Mr. Speaker, the largest commitment to mental health in Saskatchewan history. Mr. Speaker, included in that, there's a number of opportunities for CBOs. There will be RFPs issued for both pre- and post-addiction treatment beds. Mr. Speaker, we're going to rely on CBOs to help us in serving the citizens of Saskatchewan in mental health and addictions, Mr. Speaker. To the member's point about the percentage of increase, Mr. Speaker, a couple of years ago, it's no secret, certainly there was a very difficult budget. There were very difficult economic times in the province. But, Mr. Speaker, if you look at it long-term under our government, we certainly support CBOs, Mr. Speaker. In fact, in the 10 years we've been given the privilege of forming government, CBO lifts across the spectrum in health have been over 40%.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Mr. Speaker, the last 5 years it's been a 3% lift to those CBO organizations providing vital services. I don't know if he's aware, but those community-based organizations are saying things like, "We are literally burning out here." That is a direct quote from the Schizophrenia Society, Mr. Speaker. Community-based organizations like Mobile Crisis, the Canadian Mental Health Association, Crocus Co-op, and the Lighthouse, just to name a few, that offer frontline support, got zeros last year and only received a 1% increase in this budget to cover salaries. That is a drop in the bucket and doesn't reflect the growing number of people with mental health and substance use disorders that rely on them for help. In the fall, in the media, Rita Field, the Executive Director with Saskatoon Crisis Intervention Services, said the increased demand had become, quote, too much, and they were having to leave people in crisis waiting in the queue. The organization was seeking more support from the province, but the Health Minister didn't have anything to offer to help cope with increased demand. Does this minister recognize health CBOs take pressure off police services and our emergency rooms, and investments in these vital frontline supports save millions in the long run?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, once again, we do recognize the good work of the CBOs across this province, Mr. Speaker. We rely on them greatly. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to do so as I outlined some of the things in this year's budget that we're going to rely on CBOs to assist us in. We recognize the importance of mental health and addictions treatment in this province, Mr. Speaker. As a matter of fact, just this morning I had the opportunity to meet with representatives from the Canadian Mental Health Association, the Saskatchewan branch, Mr. Speaker, who frankly are very pleased with the budget announcements this year, Mr. Speaker. They recognize, obviously, that there's more work to be done. I offered and they accepted to be consulting with them along the way, Mr. Speaker. We're already talking about potential new initiatives we could introduce next year, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with stakeholders such as that, Mr. Speaker, and CBOs across this province.
The member for Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Those new initiatives are important, Mr. Speaker, but they also need help for their existing initiatives that they have operating, that they've been starved of resources, Mr. Speaker. Hear, hear. After this minister tried to cut a full 10% of health funding, CBO health funding, that same minister said his government changed course because, quote, they value the work of health-funded CBOs. If this was truly the case, and if this government does in fact want to tackle the mental health crisis, they wouldn't be starving those doing the important work on the front lines. Years of austerity budgets and putting those CBOs in a position where they will have no choice but to claw back services. Will this minister allow this to happen on his watch, or will he commit to funding increases for our health CBOs today?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I think the member does a disservice to CBOs across this province when she torques questions like that, talking about a 10% reduction, which never occurred, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the history speaks for itself. From 07-08, Ministry of Health CBO spending has increased by 40... Mr. Speaker, spending has increased by 49.5% to CBOs from ministry. Mr. Speaker, from the Saskatchewan Health Authority, CBO spending has increased by 74.6%, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, we rely on CBOs to a great deal. I can see us expanding that, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue in that way.
As a member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Minister of Justice if he planned on following the Information and Privacy Commissioner's recommendation to make watershed associations subject to LA FOIP, but he didn't have a clue what we were talking about. So we hand-delivered the report to his office in the hopes that he can find his feet today. The Smith Creek Watershed Association is expropriating land, yet they refuse to release their finances. The Quill Lakes Watershed Association refuses to release information about their flooding plans. These are bodies that are not elected, Mr. Speaker, yet they have considerable government-like powers to levy taxes and expropriate land. Now, landowners shouldn't have to dump boxes of tea into Smith Creek in order to prevent taxation without representation, one of the fundamental principles of modern democracy. So, to the Minister, has he now read the Privacy Commissioner's recommendations? Will he accept them? And if not, why not?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for the opportunity to reply and give a more fulsome answer. I have talked to the officials in the Ministry of Justice. They received the report last fall from the Privacy Commissioner. And, Mr. Speaker, what they've done since that time is they've conducted some internal reviews and had some discussions with the Water Security Agency, and are trying to come up with something that will accommodate the different varieties of how the watershed authorities are structured. Some of them have got a large number of public entities. Some members have got a variety of differences. They want to ensure that they've got good methods of accountability and good methods of having a proper structure that complies with the existing legislation to determine whether it's a reg change or whether a piece of legislation need be changed, Mr. Speaker. So the process is underway. The work is being done between the Ministry of Justice and the Water Security Agency.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, the Sask Party's strange dealings when it comes to the Commissioner's recommendations with watershed associations isn't limited to LA FOIP. It also connects to the GTH. Back in November of last year, the Sask Party created the East Cottonwood Creek Watershed Association, and a board was appointed. Now, normally, a watershed association is made up of rural municipalities, towns, villages, irrigation districts, but this one is different, Mr. Speaker. In the Order in Council approving the association, they included Dream Development, a private corporation, as a member of the board. This is the only watershed association in Saskatchewan that actually includes giving a private corporation taxation and expropriation authority. Why on earth is the Sask Party government appointing private corporations to the board of a watershed association, a body with the power to levy taxes and expropriate land?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the legislation is designed to accommodate a variety of different situations that would come about dealing with drainage across numerous parcels of property. So it deals with private landowners, developers, government agencies, and a variety of different situations where they might arise, Mr. Speaker. The process went through in the ordinary course. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite stand in this House day after day and say, consult, 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 and if they're not happy with the results of the consultation, they stand up and they say, sue somebody or pass a law today. Mr. Speaker, that's not how government works. We will do appropriate consultation. We will work through methodically and carefully and try and provide good, meaningful resolutions that work well for the citizens of Saskatchewan. We will not be like the members opposite and do things on on an instant sue today, pass a law tomorrow. That's not how we work, Mr. Speaker.
There's a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this is what we say day after day, that the people of Saskatchewan expect openness, transparency, and accountability from this government. But all they get is nothing but obstruction, distraction, and impunity. We see this in the refusal to implement the Commissioner's recommendation to include watershed authorities in the FOI Act, and we see it in their mishandling of one village council's repeated failures to comply with that same act. Just last week, Mr. Speaker, the Privacy Commissioner issued his 14th report on the northern village of Pine House failure to comply with the basic freedom of information request, or even to pick up the phone, Mr. Speaker, when the Commissioner calls. But there's a simple fix for the Minister to fix this impasse. Give the Commissioner the authority to order documents to be made public. To the Minister of Justice, commit to this simple and necessary fix. Will the Minister do the right thing and provide people with the accountability that they've been asking for day after day?
Here, here.
As the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, in regards to Pine House, I believe the details have been presented a number of times here, but we've certainly responded to the Privacy Commissioner, the Freedom of Information requests that were unaided, that we provided we instigated an inspection. From that inspection, we certainly had some unanswered questions. We therefore put forward an inquiry. With that inquiry now, we're hoping to get answers to some of our questions and concerns there. When that's completed, we've had a chance to review it. We will certainly be able to provide details to the House.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on Human Services to report Bill number 157, the Education Amendment Act 2018, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in committee of the whole on bills? I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in committee of the whole on this bill and that the bill will now be read a third time.
Ministers request a leave to waive consideration committee of the whole on bill number 157 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read a third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that bill number 157 be now read third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Orders of the day. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the committees may continue their work. I move this House to now adjourn.
It's been moved that the Assembly to now adjourn. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt that motion? Carried. This Assembly now stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Thank you.